Knight is the 2022 Marvel TV show starring Oscar Isaac, Ethan Hawke, and May Kalamaui. In this episode of Costume as Character, I spoke with Moon Knight's Emmy-nominated costume designer Meghan Kasperlik about how to craft authenticity, marrying CGI with practical costumes, and how to dress a cult leader. So Moon Knight is probably one of the lesser known Marvel superheroes. Please don't come at me with comments about that. I'm sorry. And as a result, there wasn't maybe as much previously done for Meghan to reference. And so she really kind of leaned into the comics for Moon Knight, Mr. Knight, and Khonshu, because they're the three sort of key visual touchstones to bounce off of for the TV show. Now, the flip side of that is you've got Marc Spector and Stephen Grant, who are sort of new. Obviously they exist in the comics, but they're just sort of normal people. So there's a little more kind of freedom and flexibility with that. But obviously, Meghan had to differentiate between Marc and Stephen, and you have Oscar Isaac obviously doing the much lauded and applauded accent work as Stephen Grant. But there's also other subtle ways that you can kind of signpost to viewers, not only that these are two different characters, but that they're really different, fundamentally different people. So it's not just the kind of necessarily the literal clothes they're wearing, but how they're made and what purpose they serve.
With Marc, Oscar, from working on another show, had like a contact with who was a special ops guy. So I spoke to this guy and was like, oh, when you're trying to blend in, I would imagine you would wearing like black and like charcoal gray. And he's like, no, you wear like a neutral, like even tone of gray, you wear brown and you wear navy blue, because people don't remember that because there's such a chicness to black, but people remember that. So if you're trying to blend in, wear like browns, navies, like not so you're standing out as much. And I thought that was like so fascinating.
In terms of developing the character of Marc Spector and Stephen Grant, Meghan worked quite closely with Oscar Isaac as well as with Ethan Hawke on developing the character and how they dress and how that informs who they are as people. And I think that's a really fundamental thing that a lot of us maybe as viewers take for granted, is that so much of who these characters are as people is reflected in the clothes that they wear, in the same way that it is for you and I. When we get dressed in the morning, we think about how we feel in ourselves and then what we want to present to the world. And that is the same thing with a fictional character. It's just you're making very specific choices to signal things to viewers. And so when you look at the difference between Stephen and Marc, even when it comes down to they're wearing the exact same clothes in the mental hospital scenes, but the fit is different. And that is the way in which you can say something about each character.
Stephen's costumes are all like have a little bit more room and feel, and Marc's are a little bit to see his physique. I did that also with the mental hospital as well. Like Marc's are a little, like he has the smaller size, Stephen has the bigger size, and just the subtleties of that.
As Meghan explains, Marc wears a kind of the more fitted clothes. He's more confident maybe in his physique. And Stephen wears baggier, looser fitting things, is trying to maybe hide himself a little bit more. And so you've got those really interesting little details that help you differentiate the characters.
So what, this is what reality looks like?
Moon Knight opens with Ethan Hawke's Arthur Harrow, and straight away we are treated to a really pivotal moment of costume design. And that is in the sandals that Ethan Hawke is wearing. And the thing you probably remember about the scene is that he crushes up glass and sticks it in his shoe, which is like super creepy and weird. But actually what's most interesting about the choice of those sandals is that it reflects something that Meghan was trying to say about the way cult leaders dress.
In discussing cult leaders, what we have known in history is that they're kind of like simply dressed or basically dressed. There's nothing super eccentric except for maybe the glasses or a haircut. The sandal came into place because the costume and the elegance of that, I was like, well, there has to be something off. There has to be something like weird about this. And when he put on these like kind of almost like platform huaraches, I was like, oh, they're kind of clunky in like the best way possible. Right. So it kind of weighted him down. So he has this weight, but also it made him walk differently. So we definitely like did a walk in the fitting and like, how is this going to like work out? And it just really like naturally came together that way. And then when he is in the mental institution, the shoes that he has are similar to the clunky Hirachi sandal, but they're like the everyday man weirdo sandal. Like we're making that.
Oi, Stephen, what the hell are we wearing?
I don't know. She said I needed a suit.
Yeah, the ceremonial armor from Concha's temple, not Psycho Colonel Sanders.
Well, I don't know how any of this shit works, man. I do look sharp, though.
In these kind of big budget, blockbustery superhero films and shows, we've come to expect a lot of CGI. And sometimes it works really, really well, and other times it kind of naggles and sticks out a little bit. And obviously, with superheroes in particular, there are the moments of costume change that happen magically, right? You can think of Doctor Strange, you can think of the helmets in the new Thor movie. There's lots of ways in which the costume has to suddenly appear on a character. And obviously that takes a lot of CGI work. The interesting thing that Meghan revealed to me in our conversation was how the CGI actually reflects practical costume design in the way in which Moon Knight's costume comes around Marc Spector when he sort of transforms into the superhero.
All of the costumes are practical. So everything was made, the actors wore it like on set. Khonshu, there was like 6 different fabrics with different textures that were used to create that costume. And it was all hand sewn. And then with the visual effects department, I worked very closely with them and Sean Faden, who was like head of that department. And we were giving fabric samples, pattern pieces, how we constructed the garments, so that when everything generated, they actually had the pattern of how we constructed the garment so that they could CG that for like Moon Knight. So when like the wrappings come around like this, we gave them the pattern pieces of how that like worked so that they could do so.
Now, obviously, this might not be something that is readily noticeable to your average viewer, but what it does and what Meghan sort of spoke about was it creates a really unique process for that character, because it's the practical way in which the costume is assembled. And when you think back to who Moon Knight is, who Khonshu is, and something that Meghan touches on as well in our conversation is how the mummy wrappings become part of the way the costume is made. And so you have this reflection of ancient and contemporary sort of magical. And by creating a CGI that references a practical skill of sewing, you're marrying up these two disparate things of the kind of ancient past and then this contemporary superhero modernism. So you have these connecting threads that bind the characters together, but also sew them throughout the time frame, right? All of those kind of cultural references of ancient Egypt iconography into the present day. One of the kind of unexpected, I guess, benefits of this practical costume being worked into the CGI is that it lends a much more real and tactile viewing experience. It grounds you in the show and in the characters more because you can see how they move in that fabric and you can see how it affects the way that they feel in themselves physically, which is quite a different experience to when you've watched some of the other superhero shows that might rely much more on CGI. A perfect example is Thor: Love and Thunder and the helmets that magically come on and off that don't seem to matter to the characters. All of a sudden there's this massive metal wing thing over their faces and they're moving and acting and behaving just as they were when there was nothing there. And that is a sort of jarring, it's a disconnect that as a viewer you might not be consciously aware of, or you might be, depending on how bad the gaffe is, but it is enough that it breaks the realism. So Moon Knight obviously isn't the first superhero show or film to take place in Egypt. We had Wonder Woman 1984, which had loads of scenes that took place in Egypt. And when Moon Knight director Mohamed Diab was making Moon Knight, he was very adamant that he wanted to sort of right the wrongs of Wonder Woman 1984 in the way in which it represented a modern day Egypt.
He was like very adamant from day one that the Egyptians were represented in a way of, this is not Hollywood in the sense of like fabulizing what Egyptians have been represented in other scenarios. And he wanted it to be very real. I do a tremendous amount of research for any project that I do. All of that Egypt that we filmed was in the backlots of Budapest where we filmed. And the Egyptians that like there's actually an Egyptian community in Budapest, and they came to the set and they're like, we feel like we're in Egypt. Like it was really amazing that they felt like, oh my gosh, we're there. And it's crediting like the team who was able to do that. So I always think that no matter what project I'm on, it's always very important to do as much research as possible.
For some reason, it made me think about bagels and the idea that you get really good bagels in New York because of the water. And the idea that there's something that you're not necessarily paying attention to is so instrumental in this like huge part of New York identity, right? And how fabric and color and dye and water make up these subtle things about what a fabric might look like in the background, of someone's shirt or on a covered wagon or like a food stall or something like that. It's so interesting to think of how those details create this bigger kind of picture.
Yeah. By the way, you're hired. Thank you for thinking of all of those things. You're hired.
Moon Knight did another quite exciting thing, which is it introduced Scarlet Scarab. And that was a really big moment for Marvel, particularly for Egyptian women to see an female Egyptian superhero. And what was most interesting about that character was that Meghan got to sort of design all that stuff from scratch, because that's not a character that existed in the comics. That's another example to touch on another point that we made of the work of CGI and practical design married together. Almost everything in that costume is practical, and you really get a sense of the weight of that moment because you get a sense of the weight of the costume. You can see that this is an important moment and that the character has some interesting details in the costume that show you the progression of her as a superhero.
And then of course the Scarlet Scarab that is on here. Now the Scarlet Scarab that is on her chest, the wings are down. And when it's on Towerette's chest, because there's also a scarab, the wings are out. So it's like the symbolism of like mirroring those two, but like Towerette's wings are out because she has like flourished and she's like now training Scarlet Scarab. And then when Scarlet Scarab comes, her wings are physical wings that come out. And it was such a cool moment when those wings came out. I kind of guessed.
Before Moon Knight came out, one of the other debates kind of in the Twitter sphere, but also I think for a lot of people who were fans of the comic and are Marvel fans and happen to also be Jewish, was the debate around the character's Jewish identity. Some people see it as quite integral to the character, others don't. The show made a conscious decision to make Marc Spector Jewish. As a Jewish person myself, I found it really interesting to speak with Meghan about how they made those decisions for those scenes for Marc Spector.
One thing you don't see is that both Marc and Steven wore a Star of David the entire series. Like Oscar did not take it off. Like he had the necklace on the entire time. It was like a big discussion in the beginning. I spoke to a rabbi, and then Oscar spoke, and I spoke to the rabbi and the director and the producers about that moment a lot. I don't know. I think it was definitely like discussed, and it was just like edited a little bit different.
Yeah. It was actually quite surprising to me to learn that Meghan and Oscar had done so much research into Judaism and Jewishness, because it doesn't really translate when you're watching the show. Not that every show has to represent every person under the sun or do the best job possible, but it was pretty clear early doors that this was going to be an issue of contention for fans, and the show was obviously aware of that enough that Mohammed Diab actually tweeted to fans to say, just reserve your judgment until you see these last few episodes and I think you'll be satisfied. Obviously, it's up to every individual viewer whether that was enough for them or not. The show itself could have done a little more, in my opinion. The kind of continuity of character development is a bit stilted because of the way in which the episodes tell the story. So for me, I think it was quite interesting to learn that all of this work had gone on behind the scenes and to see the ways in which sometimes it's really successful and sometimes it isn't. If you enjoyed this episode of Costume is Character, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. And if there's any other films or shows or costume designers that you want us to talk to or about, let us know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching.